Welcome to Fairy Tale Access, where the head fairy's quest is to prove that fairy tales do exist in actual time rather than once upon a time. Together, we will unravel the heroes, young and old, who turn dreams into reality. These are the people who still believe in happily ever after. The discoveries will bend even our most cynical non-believers into believing in fairy tales. Hi, welcome to Fairy Tale Access. Today, I'm excited to introduce you to Jonathan Help of the Pat Conroy Literacy Center with their new book, Our Prince of Scribes. And it is amazing. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's so good to be here with you.
Oh, my pleasure. This book was fantastic. So how many people contributed to it?
Yeah, this is a collaborative effort, and there are 67 writers who are featured in the book all together. All of us have two things in common. We're all writers in some inclusive sense of that word. And we all knew Pat Conroy at some point over a span of really 50 years. The earliest pieces in the collection come from people who were classmates of Pat Conroy in high school, Beaufort High School, right here in town. And they go up to people who knew him very late in life as well. So it's a really inclusive overview of Pat, not as he would have told his own story. He had 12 of his own books in which he got to do that, but as we got to experience it alongside of him.
What I loved about it is that I had read a couple of things of Pat Conroy's in the past, but I didn't know him as a person. So in the book, for instance, when it opened with your part of the story, I was like, what did he get fired for? Like, you didn't mention it. And then I had to read a little further, and somebody else talked about that whole incident, the way that he interacted with his audience. But it was great. It was almost like a little bit of a mystery because everybody gave a part of it, but then it all came together the further you got into the book. And you found out exactly what happened instead of having to run to the Pat Conroy Center and nail you down because I needed to know everything. So it must have been a challenge to put it together.
It really was. And I got to give all credit to my co-editor, Nicole Seitz, for arranging the essays in the order that they're in. Nicole is a really wonderful novelist, and that's the mindset that she brought to the book. It took us about a year and a half to gather these essays. We began just after Pat Conroy passed away, which was March 4th of 2016. And some of the pieces were published. Rick Bragg's piece, for example, was published in Southern Living. And a few of the other pieces appeared elsewhere, but a lot of them were being gathered specifically for this book. They've never been published anywhere else. And they were coming in sort of incrementally over this long span of time. And Nicole was sort of thinking about how they fit. And exactly as you described, we wanted the pieces to form a cohesive narrative, to actually tell one story told by 67 different writers, many of whom did not know each other before this project began. And we didn't want to just tell the stories that Pat had already told. He's got 12 wonderful books in which you can read those. We wanted to tell the stories that we experienced alongside of them. Some of these moments are so super personal. There's nobody there except for Pat Conroy and this writer that he's helping in this really small, intimate moment, and the writer has never shared the story outside of the book. And reading those, for me as somebody who knew Pat for 12 years, it was a way to get to know my friend even better than I had when he was around.
I know. What I liked about it is that the same way that Pat Conroy put those bare emotions into his stories, like the story about the father and son, you guys were able to project that same personal experience with him, which was just amazing the way it came out.
Well, Pat was a writer who went deeply into himself. He said late in life that his whole writing career was a 50-year effort to try and understand the guy he saw in the mirror each day in the hopes that would be meaningful to other people as well. And the story you mentioned, story of father and son, the great Santini, There are references in the book to how that was written and under what circumstances from people who were behind the scenes, who saw the early drafts that Pat was putting together and how difficult it was for him to be honest about the abuse of his childhood, to be honest about his relationship with his father. So we wanted to honor that in our own writing. Nothing was going to be off limits for the contributors. They could go as personal as they wanted to. And thankfully, many of them went deeply personal into sharing what Pat was like as a friend, as a father figure to some of them, literally as a father to one of them. Pat's daughter, Melissa, is in the book. His brother, Tim, is in the book as well, because there are so many really wonderful writers in the Conroy family. We get a lot of those family stories that are deeply personal. But Pat's relationships with his friends was very much the same. There was a very thin line for Pat between friend and family.
Yeah, I love the running theme about the late night phone calls.
Oh, yes. He was great about that. It was kind of amazing, too. He would always call late at night, well after dark. And, if you didn't answer, there was no point calling him back because he would not answer. But you'd get this wonderful voicemail message that began always the same, always some variation on, it's Conroy, or DP Conroy, as he would often say. I guess it's up to me to keep our dying friendship alive. And occasionally there was a string of expletives added to that, depending on how well he knew you. And then he would go on and on about how wonderful our friendship was and how he hoped that eventually he would hear from us. He would hang up. You would call him back. He wouldn't answer. You missed your chance, but you got a beautiful message out of it. But the reason he wouldn't answer is because he's calling the next person and then the next person and so on until he got somebody. And then he would just talk for hours. And those conversations were such treasures. He did that with a huge group of us. And he had this sort of sixth sense about who needed to hear from Pat Conroy, who out there was at a moment of crisis in their life or trying to make a decision or just feeling the need to have that comforting voice, because he would always call at the right time. It was just incredible when you did connect with him on the phone.
And how does the Pat Conroy Center fit into this? Was this created before he died or after?
That's a really good question. Pat and I together created the Pat Conroy at 70 Festival, which was his 70th birthday in October of 2015, held right here in Beaufort, where I am today. And Pat was a part of that, admittedly sort of a reluctant part initially. He was a bit embarrassed to have a festival in his honor, but he really got behind it and in the end participated beautifully in it. And it was a series of public conversations and film screenings and exhibits and workshops. When he passed away on March 4th of 2016, he had already blessed a plan for that festival to continue, but there was no plan at that point for what we are, an interpretive center, a museum. So that was created after Pat passed away. And Pat's widow, Cassandra King Conroy, his agent, Marley Rusoff, her husband, Mihai Radulasko, they were sort of the minds and the hearts behind the idea to sort of get it going. But Pat's family and his friends were very supportive. And in less than a year, the nonprofit was created, funds were amassed, a small location was secured. I was hired as executive director, Pat's former publishing partner. And in the span of just a couple of years, we've grown exponentially. The space I'm in right now, I'm seated in front of Pat Conroy's desk, which is sort of the center of our exhibit here. This is 3,000 square feet of space we're in. About 5,000 people interact with us in public events outside of this space, all over the South, at different events we host. Writers' workshops, conversations with writers, small festivals, children's book fairs, things like that. But here in the center, here in the building where I am, another 3,000 people come every single year, or at least were pre-pandemic. Obviously, circumstances are slightly different now. But it's entirely free to visit the center. There's no admission charge. People come from all over the world to visit here. They're friends, family, fans of Pat's. And what's remarkable to me, what's always been so remarkable, is they come with a story they want to tell me. I mean, they're very happy to hear me talk to them about Pat Conroy. But if they ever met him or they read something in his book that really spoke to their heart, they want to say that. They want to give those words form. So this is sort of the confession booth to the Pat Conroy universe now as well. And it's just incredible to get to do this every day, to get to share stories and hear them about that guy who was my friend and my mentor for so long.
That's amazing. What type of activities would we find if we went to visit the museum today?
Sure. Well, today we have just finished our Camp Conroy, which is our summer camp for young writers and readers, and we had to do it virtually this year. This is the third year there has been a Camp Conroy. So we had a dozen kids from 5 states on screen, very much like you and I are right now. And over the course of 2 weeks, they researched, wrote, illustrated, edited, designed, and will ultimately publish a book together around the theme of trees and growth and continuation. So with instructors scattered all over, just like the kids were, that was our project for the last 2 weeks. And that was really remarkable. It honors Pat as teacher too. But we also do right now a lot of virtual tours because it's not so easy for people to visit us in person. So we're doing a lot of things through Zoom, in which I walk around the center and tell stories behind a lot of the artifacts we have. We also still have a very active visiting writers program, both in person and remotely as well. So we have different novelists who will come in, or memoirists or poets, and share their stories. We're doing a lot with online workshops right now, about 2 or 3 a month, different genres, different writers, open to writers of all levels of experience. Those are selling out more often than not. That's something that we really weren't able to do very well in person because Beaufort is so isolated. But once it became something you could access from anywhere, writers from all over the country started signing up to take these classes with us. And that's been a really remarkable experience as well.
Definitely. What about Pat Conroy's publishing company? Is that also coordinated in some way with the center, or is that still going on?
It's not. No, what you're speaking of is Story River Books, which is what Pat and I created together about 5 years before he passed away. At that time, I was director of the University of South Carolina Press in Columbia, about 3 hours from where we are here in Beaufort. And Pat got very excited that I was interested in publishing fiction. And one day over lunch here in Beaufort, he volunteered to be editor at large, or editor at larger than life, as we always said, of Story River Books, and this fiction imprint that we created together. So during those last 5 years of Pat's life, when he was so productive, really trying to do as much as he could for as many people as he could, we selected, edited, and ultimately published 22 books together, novels and short story collections. When I left USC Press to come here to run the Conroys Center, that imprint ended as well. So those 22 books that Pat and I published together, the only 22 Story River books there will ever be. But those writers are so committed to Pat's legacy. Many of them appear in our Prince of Scribes as well, sharing their stories. John Worley, Maggie Shine, Bernie Shine, Ellen Malfris, Nicole Seitz, my co-editor, her novel, The Cage Maker, was published in Story River. It was the second to last book. Anthony Grooms, really wonderful writer, was the last writer to be published in Story River with a novel called The Vain Conversation, and he's in our Prince of Scribes too. I'll be interviewing Tony on my podcast on the Authors on the Air Global Radio Network next month. I now have this really wonderful podcast where I get to talk to writers and share the Conroy spotlight. But just a couple of days after the interview with Tony, he too is teaching a writing class for us online. So those writers from Story River Books, even though that imprint, that publishing company no longer exists, they're still very much connected to us here at the Conroy Center. And that's a wonderful relationship to get to continue and preserve as we do.
Yes. Now, what other type of activities does the center have going on? Because you're located in Beaufort, South Carolina. Is that
That's
so?
right.
The landscape behind you, is that what Beaufort looks like?
It is. There's a full wall mural behind me. It was painted by a local artist named Aki Kato, Japanese born, but he lives here in Beaufort now. And he had done several pieces, which you probably can't see. They're probably just a little bit out of frame, but they were gifts to Pat, commissioned by Pat's siblings. And the mural behind me is very much what the Low Country looks like. When Pat was actually writing at this desk behind me, this was on Fripp Island, where Pat moved in the 1990s when he was working on beach music, when he came back to the Low Country in South Carolina. And he had this desk pushed up against a window, so he was looking out at a scene very much like the one Aki has painted. This is the landscape that Pat Conroy fell in love with when he was a 15-year-old boy and he came to Beaufort for the first time as a military brat. It was the landscape that he wrote about in all of his novels and memoirs, even when he wasn't living here, even when he was effectively banished from the state. In his imagination, he was still trying to get back here. So we want our visitors to go out and see that landscape too. So we do this annual event commemorating Pat Conroy's death, which may seem at first like a sort of morbid thing to do, but I mentioned the date a couple of times already, March 4th. And it was Pat's widow, Cassandra, who heard that as a sentence, as a directive that were meant to literally March 4th to continue forward. So on or around that anniversary, we go out to St. Helena Island, 2 sea islands out from where we are right now in a world that looks very much like the one in the mural, at a place called Penn Center. It was very dear to Pat as a young person, and we made very special arrangements to be buried on Penn Center grounds. So we go out there and we do our annual March 4th, which is a day of learning about social justice and literature and the environment. And we get to walk the grounds. We get to go out in nature. We've done that more often than not with a writer who never got to know Pat, although I think they would have been great friends had they had the opportunity. His name's Drew Lanham, and he's from Clemson, South Carolina, north of where we are. Really wonderful poet and memoirist and birder. And he leads our nature tour out on St. Helena into a world that, again, looks very much like this mural behind me. So we want people to see it. We don't want them just to come here and see the Conroy Center, although that's a lovely experience in itself. We want them to see the environment that Pat wrote about that was so dear to him.
Definitely, because the way he writes about the environment, it's when you're really getting into the book, you can almost smell it. He's just so good at being descriptive without going crazy about it.
Absolutely. Well, Pat started out wanting to be a poet, and we sort of think of him as a failed poet. It's the thing he couldn't do. But he took everything he loved about poetry and he transferred that into his prose. And part of it was the lyrical, beautiful, descriptive language, the way to sort of bring the world to you through words. So you see that in Pat's writing. And some of the writers in our Prince of Scribes are poets, are really wonderful, successful poets. Marjorie Wentworth, Ellen Malfritz, Pat's brother, Tim Conroy. And they speak to that too. They speak to being drawn into the way, not just what Pat wrote about, but how he wrote about those subjects, that lyrical beauty that you're describing.
It's beautiful. And The Prince of Tides was so well done. And it came out as a great movie too. Usually they're so different from the book, but it kind of has of it.
It did. I mean, it's a small slice of what's in the book, of course, as movies always are, but it's a really well-told story. And it was filmed primarily right here in Beaufort. We have a lot of memorabilia from that movie here in the Conroy Center. And Barbara Streisand, who wrote, directed, starred, produced the film, has been one of our largest supporters here at the Conroy Center, particularly during the early years when the center was starting. And you may have noticed that she wrote the foreword to our Prince of Scribes as well. So she's actually in the essay collection with us. She wrote a really wonderful birthday letter to Pat for his 70th birthday for that Conroy at 70 festival I mentioned. And that plus a little headnote became the foreword to our Prince of Scribes. So she was very generous and supportive of that collection, of that book, in addition to the center here as well. Pat had a really wonderful relationship with a lot of the people from his films. Michael O'Keefe, who was the young star of the film The Great Santini, who played Ben Meacham, the character who's based on Pat. Michael is a really wonderful poet. He has an MFA in creative writing, and he too is a contributing writer to our Prince of Scribes, talking about what that relationship with Pat Conroy really meant with him at a young age when he was really just starting out in film.
The other thing that I found really helpful about the book was just the way people remember people. Like when somebody dies, you always want to write something heartfelt, and it can be so consuming because you're upset at that time, but you want to send something. I think this book really helps writers with being able to put their thoughts together in a more fluid manner, the way that all of these writers did.
I think it
was just the way that they were sharing parts of his life. I mean, some of them brought you to tears. Some of them made you laugh out loud, but just being able to project that emotion for the reader. I thought it was a great book for just that in general, besides being like a mystery that you are unraveling all the way through.
Well, when we were inviting these essays, when Nicole and I were reaching out to these writers, it was just after Pat Conroy had died. So this was really sort of therapeutic exercise for so many of the writers. Pat was very dear to them. They needed a way to put that on a page. And there's an essay that's really early in the book from a writer named Valerie Sayers. She was a Beaufort High School student of Pat's. He taught Beaufort High School for 2 years before he went out to Daufuskie Island teaching psychology and African-American studies. And Valerie was one of his psychology students. She's now a really successful award-winning novelist and short story writer, and she's one of our board members here at the Conroy Center. That essay makes me cry every single time I read it. And this is now years after I read it for the first time, because it's so emotional and it's so beautifully written. It's such a good model of how to write a personal essay, too. But there are pieces like that in the book where I think, the writer gave us a gift, the readers a gift by writing the piece, but we also gave the writer a gift by giving them the opportunity to tell that story. There's a writer from Charleston named Sean Scapoletto who is in the book, and it's probably not a name that a lot of people have heard. Pat's circle of friends was very inclusive. You didn't have to be a famous writer to be his friend. You just had to be a good writer, and Sean is a very good writer. But when we invited Sean to write his essay for the book, 1,500-word limit, he wrote about 10,000 words because that's what was in his heart in that moment that he needed to get out. And I'm so glad we gave him that opportunity. We then had to find the 1,500 words that we could actually publish in the book. But it sort of lit a fire in Sean to go back to his writing life, something he had stepped away from. And he's now got a novel that he's nearly done with, and he's shopping around, and he's become a teacher again. He is a lawyer now in his real day job, but he's gotten to teach classes with us here at the Conroy Center, and he'll be doing that again in August as part of our Prince of Scribes Writers Conference. So, the essays themselves are beautiful, but they're a beauty that people needed to put on the page. They were motivated by the grief for Pat Conroy to do something with that, something meaningful.
Exactly. And I think the general public benefits from a book like this because of all of those reasons. I mean, literacy is important. Being able to write and being able to express yourself, whether it's a letter to a friend or, an email for a job, it's just incredibly important. And this book gives you a dynamic look at it from a lot of different perspectives so that you can find your own voice, which I thought was an incredible benefit.
It's a way to honor Pat Conroy as teacher, too. Of the 67 writers who are in the book, 54 of us have now participated in at least one public event, across a dozen states, whatever it is now. But in the Q&A of those events, we noticed that so many people were asking questions, not just about Pat Conroy, not just about us, but about being a writer, about the writing life. This is something that they too wanted to experience, and something was holding them back, a job, a career, the anxiety, writer's block, whatever it was. They just weren't able to cross the threshold. So about a year ago, almost a year to the day, we held our first Our Prince of Scribes Writers Conference in Charleston, just a one-day event. All of the instructors, all 5 of us that day, were contributing writers to Our Prince of Scribes. And we thought if we get a dozen people to show up, that'll be great. It'll be time well spent. We sold out at 50 people. We raised the cap. We sold out at 60 people. And that was really as many as we could get in that first day. We thought this was great. We really impacted a lot of lives in a way that Pat would experience. Let's do that again. So we had a second Our Prince of Scribes Writers Conference with a different group of teachers in Aiken, South Carolina, the other side of the state, came back to the Low Country, did one in Somerville. So there have been 3 of those last year. We're about to hold our fourth in August, in August, in a town called Ridgeland, not far from where we are, at the Low Country Heritage Center there. But that will be accessible on Zoom, online. So that'll be the first time that somebody anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world will be able to participate in one of these Our Prince of Scribes Writers Conferences. And it's a model we hope we get to continue for a long time. A lot of the folks who are in this book are teachers in their professional lives. Some are not. They wouldn't self-identify as teacher, but they have something to teach. They have something that they are good at, that they can convey as a mentor to another writer. And this is giving them a chance to teach, some of them for the very first time. And that conference in August is going to be really unique for us in another interesting way, too. We have a high school intern here at the Conroy Center, Holland Perriman, a really fantastic writer, and she is going to co-teach a session at the Our Prince of Scribes conference in August. So this will be her first time as a 15-year-old to teach to a group of adults, and it's our chance to sort of teach her how to do that as well. So it's an exciting new variation on the model that we're all looking forward to.
That sounds wonderful. So where can people get information about the Pat Conroy Center and all the events? Would they be on there as well?
Yes, absolutely. So we have a really wonderful website, which is patconroyliterarycenter.org. And one of the first things you can do on that homepage is sign up for our newsletter, which we call Hey Out There. It's how Pat began a lot of his correspondence and his blogs. And that goes out every couple of weeks. It lists all of our upcoming programs, including a lot of entirely free programs that we're doing right now through Zoom or through our YouTube channel as video content. So there's always stuff that you can tap into and experience from wherever you are. But that's also the way that you can sign up for classes or learn more about what hours the center is open. We have an annual literary festival as well. What I mentioned early on in our interview is the Pat Conroy at 70 Festival now continues every year. So we're starting to put information out about this year's festival, which will be the first weekend in November, November 6th through 8th. And there's going to be a huge exhibit that's tied to it this year of artwork being created by members of the National Association of Women Artists, all inspired by Pat Conroy. So that's going to be a real centerpiece of this year's festival.
Well, thank you for sharing so much about the book, the center, and the amazing things that you have going on for people. It was a pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure to share this time and some stories about my friend Pat Conroy with you. So I'm really grateful to you for this opportunity.
My pleasure. And the center is now open at limited hours, correct?
That's right. Thursday through Sunday from noon to 4, unless we're doing a virtual program. So our website and our social media, our Facebook page, Instagram, all make clear what our hours are. And again, it's entirely free. There's no admission charge to visit us here.
That's fantastic. Thank you again. Until next time, keep asking questions. And if you need to learn or want to learn more about literacy, storytelling, this is a great work to get you started. And then visit the Pat Conroy Literary Center. You'll find an amazing wealth of knowledge. We'll see you soon.